This week on Q&A, our guest is Christopher Caldwell, who writes for the Weekly Standard and is the author of a new book, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, Immigration, Islam, and the West.
Christopher Caldwell, your book, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, came about because of what?
Well, I've always been really interested in immigration. In the late 1980s, I started to get interested in Latin America. And I began to write about it in late 1989. I went down and covered the coup in Panama shortly before Noriega was toppled. And I thought, this is a really great thing to do. I'm so interested in this. And then the Berlin Wall came down, the Cold War ended, and editors were totally uninterested in sending journalists to Latin America to cover anything. But I kept this interest in Latin American culture, and one way to cover it was by covering immigration into the United States. And I just love, I love the topic of immigration. About midway through the 90s, when I was thinking about going to Tijuana to write a book on Tijuana, it occurred to me that the immigration in Europe was not really developing along the same lines that the American one was. It was much more disruptive. It was much more full of problems for the society. It was much more traumatic for the people who lived there. So I started reporting on that, at first for the Atlantic Monthly. But then, so that was in the late 1990s. But then when September 11th happened, there was a lot of interest in these communities, in how well they were assimilating and what their ideas were and what Europeans were doing about them. And I wound up making dozens and dozens of trips, and it became a very natural thing for me to write a book about.
You say in the book that we have about 35 million people in the United States who were born in other countries.
Right.
In Europe, first of all, what's the population base? Here it's 307 million. What's the population base you're writing about in Europe?
Yeah, this book is really about Western Europe, about what used to be called the EU 15 or now the EU 25. The 15 Western European countries that constitute the core of the European Union. They have a population just under 400 million. And there are about 50 million people living outside their country of birth. In those countries. They're not all from outside of Europe, but a significant proportion of them are. And a significant proportion of the non-European immigrants are from Muslim lands. And there are now about 20 million Muslims in Europe.
And your figure on the United States is 2 million Muslims here.
It really varies greatly depending on how you reckon in black Muslims. Whether you count them in the group. There are arguably millions of those. I didn't really get into that in the United States, but yes, Muslim immigration to the United States is much smaller. It's an exponentially larger phenomenon in Europe, largely because of the countries they're next to. You know, they're right next to North Africa in the way that we're right next to Latin America.
You had these figures in the book that there were 5 million foreign-born, I believe, in France. I'm not sure
that's about right.
And 4 million in Germany.
Germany, there has been a dramatic revision of statistics over the summer since this book was published. There are about 7.5 million foreign-born, in foreigners as they're called in Germany, and many of them have. Germany has a funny way of counting these things. It counts certain people born in Germany as so-called foreigners if they don't have German citizenship. But yeah, there are about 7.5 million foreigners, as the Germans call it, in Germany.
Out of about 80 million?
Out of, it's a shrinking population, out of about 75 million.
Really?
Yeah. And there was a radical upward revision in the number of Muslims in Germany. That it had been thought that there were 3 million, but the Interior Ministry did another count earlier this summer and came up with the figure of 4.5.
What's the 2 million figure of the 60 million people that live in Britain? What are those 2 million? Are they foreign-born?
The 2 million, no, I believe the foreign-born number is higher than that. The 2 million is the number of is the rough number of Muslims in Britain. Although Britain is very imprecise about counting these things, and they have changed their way of counting in the last 10 years.
Let's go back over those three countries. What kind of immigrant is there that's a Muslim in Germany?
It has evolved over time. The beginning of the immigration to Europe had to do with Europe's extreme needs for reconstruction after World War II. You had cities entirely destroyed. You had much of the labor force killed, and there was a lot to build. When that happened, countries with empires, such as Britain, the Netherlands, France, brought people from their old empires. Countries without empires, like Germany, signed bilateral agreements with poorer countries, starting in Europe, but eventually spreading further afield, to bring labor in. So the usual, and no one really was thinking in the slightest about what religion these people were when they drew up these agreements. Your typical Muslim immigrant to Europe in the 1950s was a laborer. It was one guy coming to work in a steel mill or a coal mine, or to be an engineer on a subway car, or to work in a lace mill, for instance, in France. But as time went on, let's take the example of Germany that you mentioned. As time went on, this system of bringing in guest workers, as they were called, for 2-year periods, businessmen realized it was not the most efficient way to do it. To get a guest worker, you had to send a recruiter, you had to send a team of evaluators, you had to send doctors to Turkey. It was an expensive process. Then you get a guy, he comes to Germany, he works out great, he's a super laborer. Well, it's an awful expensive process to send him back and get another guy who might not be as good. So companies petitioned to let these people stay. Well, some of these people had families. So the next wave of immigrants was not a labor immigration. It was reuniting these people with families. Over time, and this happens, I believe, in most mass immigrations, you have an immigration of labor gets replaced by an immigration of settlement. So today, only a very, very small minority of immigrants admitted to Europe are for labor purposes. A far larger number are for family reunification and political and other kinds of asylum.
But back to Germany, how many of those 7.5 million now are Turks?
Turkey, there were many, many different countries in the guest worker program. But Turkey soon came to take up the preponderant, came to be the major country in the guest worker program. And in the course of the guest worker program, there were 18 million Turks came to Germany. Most of them were rotated back as the program envisioned. I'm not exactly sure of the number. It's somewhere around 3 million of the foreign-born.
And their base is Muslim. Most of the Turks that came
absolutely.
to Germany.
Yes.
And then in France, how many of them are Algerians or Moroccans, and is that the Muslim base?
Now, France is very, very difficult for statistics because France has had, since the French Revolution, a very radical idea of citizen equality. So there's no such thing as, in the eyes of the state, there's no such thing as an Algerian Frenchman or a Muslim Frenchman. There are only Frenchmen. So it's not permitted to ask those questions on census. The best demographers in France, I would say the very best demographer in France who's worked on this, is a woman named Michelle Tribalat. She has come up with an estimate which is somewhat lower than other demographers of the number of Muslims in France, of around 4 million. And I think those are fairly evenly distributed between about 1 million apiece of the 3 North African countries, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, with a smattering of people from elsewhere. But again, these numbers are extremely imprecise.
And then in Great Britain, Pakistanis and from Bangladesh, is that
Right.
the majority of the Muslims?
They're Pakistanis, they're Bengalis from Bangladesh and northern India. I would say the largest group is Pakistanis, who live primarily in the north, and right behind them are the Bengalis, who tend to live in the south, in London. London is, the Muslim population is, the dominant group would be Bengalis. Yeah.
Go back to your statement you made early in the conversation about the way that Europe looks at immigrants and the way the United States looks at immigrants, 2 different things. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the title of this book, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, has been a little bit controversial. People say, well, in what sense is, okay, it's a big problem, but in what sense is this a revolution? I would say in this sense, it's tempting to look at Europe's immigration over the last few decades as being similar to ours over the last few decades. And the percentages in the population are about the same. And the role of the dominant culture in the immigration, in Europe's case, the Muslim culture, in America's case, the Latin American culture, that's about the same. The big difference is that this is our second wave of mass immigration. We had one that started in the middle of the 19th century and lasted until about 1925. That, I would say, revolutionized the United States. The country that we started out with at the beginning of that migration was not the same as the country we wound up with several decades later. Several decades later, we had an idea of ourselves as a nation of immigrants. And we were much more content with the assumption that the America we know now, it may be something different in our grandchildren's time. I mean, I think this is when people began to talk about the American experiment, okay? Europeans have not yet had that revolution. They're having it now. They're not really, they don't think of themselves as an experiment. They think of themselves as firmly anchored cultures that have been the same in their essence, if not in their outward manifestations, for about 1,000 years, and they're really uncomfortable with this idea of becoming a continent of immigrants. That, I would say, is the rock bottom difference.
Near the end of your book, actually it's on page 349, I found this sentence. I'm going to read it back to you. Islam is a magnificent religion that has also been at times over the centuries glorious and generous culture, but all cant to the contrary. It is in no sense Europe's religion, and it is no sense Europe's culture. Go back to the beginning of that. Islam is a magnificent religion. Why do you say that?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, you just have to, travel around the Middle East and look at the tremendous monuments that were constructed in its name. The mosques in Turkey, the libraries, the literary culture that resulted, the beautiful calligraphy that you can and designs that you can go if you visit the Alhambra in Spain. It remains a culture. I mean, we have to grant the diversity of Islam. Okay, it's a very diverse. It has many manifestations around the world. But I mean, if you go listen to a Mameluke singing in Senegal, or look at the literary culture of Egypt, it is impressive, and you have to respect their ability to stick to this culture even in the midst of globalization. But there is a tendency to what I'm criticizing there is this tendency to say that Islam has always been a part of Europe. And people tend to use all these euphemisms to talk about the way Islam and Europe have interacted over the centuries. Islam has, for most of the past 1,300 years, been an enemy of Europe. If Europe absorbed things out of Islamic culture, it was not because the two cultures were getting along well or because they were fundamentally compatible. It was because Islam was at the time a superior culture, and they did it through imitation. In the same way that countries that are full of anti-Americanism today, countries that you would say where most of the people dislike the United States, they listen to Michael Jackson. They absorb our culture in many ways. So I'm not saying that it's impossible for Europe and Islam to get along today. The conditions are different. We have globalization. But you cannot look at this as something inevitable, because it's not what the patterns of history tell us is the likely outcome.
Your own background, when did you first get into this business of writing?
Oh boy, I was always interested in writing. I grew up loving books, and
Where was that?
I grew up in Massachusetts, and I have. It has been a very long time since I wanted to be anything other than a writer, and I don't think I ever really seriously entertained doing anything else. I mean, maybe being a great poet or novelist would have suited me better as I saw things in my teens. But after a stint in publishing, I found my way into journalism in Washington, and have been doing that for about 20 years.
Where did you go to college?
I went to Harvard.
Studying what?
Yeah, I studied English. So.
And what year did you graduate?
83.
So where now do you make your money besides writing books? Where are you?
Well,
posted?
I am a senior editor at the Weekly Standard. When you say an editor, I don't really, a senior editor doesn't really edit. I write for the Weekly Standard. I write a column in the Financial Times every Saturday. And I do a lot of articles for the New York Times Magazine, where I'm a contributing writer. And I write for other people when interesting projects come up.
Where would you put yourself on the political spectrum?
Well, it may sound funny, but I don't think of myself as an extremely political person. At least I'm not a partisan person. Temperamentally, I would say I'm quite conservative, and I'm sure that inflects a lot of the political opinions I hold. But I do try to approach every subject that I'm dealing with as a journalist, as if I were just born, and without preconceptions.
What kind of conservatism?
I don't know. It's changed over time. I tend to think that there's a lot of wisdom in tradition, and I tend to be. I have a sort of "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" attitude, maybe. I would say, as a younger man, I was more of a libertarian conservative. I think as I've aged, I've become more of just a regular small c conservative. But I think this has had a strong effect on my book too. Generally, it's books that are pessimistic about the immigrant situation in Europe take a dim view of Islam. I don't think I do. I think that this book is, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, I think this book is very respectful of Islam. And one of the things that I think makes me pessimistic about about immigration in Europe is that compared to this sort of tumult of constant change that is European society, I think the steadiness of familial and religious traditions looks like a pretty good alternative to a lot of rational people who are newcomers to Europe.
You dedicate your book to Zelda. Who
Yeah.
is she?
She is my wife. Yeah.
And when we were originally going to tape this interview, you had to cancel for
That's
for a funeral.
That's right. That was my father-in-law, Robert Novak, the journalist, whom, needless to say, we will miss terribly.
How well did you know him?
How well did I know him? Golly. Well, to the extent that you can know anyone, I knew him pretty darn well. We were very close. I loved him. And I was very, very proud to have him as a father-in-law. We didn't talk too much about politics and things like that. Our real shared interests were things like baseball and history. I mean, he was just a constant churn he was constantly churning history books through him, and he was always full of interesting things to talk about that way. To the extent that we did talk about sort of our professional lives, I always found him an immensely reliable guy to go to for journalistic ethics questions. If you have a situation like, some guy wants to take me to dinner and I don't know exactly what he wants out of me, what should I do? I found him a very rigorous person on questions like those, and so I treasured his company,
Yeah, they had a funeral. We didn't see the funeral. Was it closed?
No, it was a public funeral. It
Public
was
funeral?
open to the public.
We didn't see him for a long time when he got brain cancer. And maybe this isn't a fair question to ask you, but we know him well. We've seen him a lot. What
Sure.
was the end of his life like?
He was very sick. He was very. It was a very serious cancer, and we had a sort of, as people will in that situation, we were very full of hope, even as he declined. But it's this sort of brain cancer is very serious, and courageous though he was, and as much as he tried to put a brave and even humorous face on it, it was a pretty steep decline. I mean, he was able to write 2 or 3 columns, which meant a lot to him. One of them was about his disease. Shortly after he was diagnosed, and when he was diagnosed, I mean, he was diagnosed the same day that he had a sort of a massive seizure. So he was debilitated by that, but he quickly lost the ability to do serious journalistic work of the sort that he would have loved to do.
Just because they seemed to be combined, they couldn't have been farther apart politically. But did Senator Kennedy and Bob Novak ever talk during both of their illnesses?
Yes, and it was more Geraldine and Vicky. But the differences, ideological differences like that, I don't think meant a great deal to my father-in-law in his personal life, and I cannot say enough about the generosity that the Kennedy family showed to my mother-in-law at that time. So I think that sort of episode, I think, tends to be bigger than politics. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
back to something I found in your book that I wanted you to explain. Page 334. Quote, George W. Bush's blundering military misadventure in Iraq, unquote.
Yeah. Well, I would like the longer sentence that you're taking that from, but it's interesting. I would not call myself an opponent of the Iraq War, but it certainly was. It certainly loomed over the composition of this book. While I would not call myself an opponent of the Iraq War, I'm not a big. I was never a big fan of the rationale that George Bush had for it. In fact, I would say I supported it, but on a different rationale, which makes it which is one reason why I've been sort of surprised to see this book described as some sort of expression of support for American foreign policy, because I think, having read the book, and perhaps the people who leap to that conclusion have not read it. Having read the book, I don't think that there's much of that in there. But there's another way that Iraq, I think, really affected the way this book was written, which is that, as I say, I tend not to be a partisan political writer, I don't think. And it would not be my inclination to sort of give Europeans lectures on what they now have to do. I am describing a situation. I'm not writing a policy brief to Europeans. But I think the fact that most of my conversations that I had, both with Muslim immigrants and with European politicians and with academic experts on this sort of thing, since most of those conversations were in the context of the Iraq War, during which Europeans were exceedingly reluctant to take any advice from Americans, it might have sort of further dampened my desire to sort of sound like a Mr. Bossy Pants. So what you get in this book is a description of the situation as it is on the ground, and not any sort of manifesto of what Europeans ought to do about it.
What did 9/11 impact have on the relationship between Europe and America?
It's a very tricky thing to disentangle, because I believe that at the time it happened, there were certain tendencies that were already ripening in European life. I think that with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the removal for a time of the Soviet threat, Europeans felt that the need for solidarity with America was much less pressing. And on top of that, all of these countries had been shaped for 55 years by an American presence. They had all been sort of molded into something that was a little bit more American than what they were used to. And I think that all of the European countries were yearning for a good deal of independence from the United States. Before September 11th, there were plenty of issues on which it appeared that Europeans were going to create a pretext for a fight. The Kyoto Treaty, which the United States would not ratify. Capital punishment was becoming a major human rights issue between Europe and the United States. I think Europe really felt the need for space with the United States, and that if it had not been the Iraq War, if Europe and America had not diverged over their reaction to September 11th, they would have diverged over something else.
Back to that page area where you said that George Bush's blundering military misadventure in Europe, you have a quote, and you can help me with the guy's first name. Milne is his last name.
Seamus, I think, yeah.
It's S-E-U-M-A-S. You have a quote that I want to read from September the 11th.
Yeah.
First of all, who is he?
He's a commentator on the left for The Guardian. I don't, I don't mean to single him out. But it's in a book that attempts to pack a lot of information into a short space. You need to sort of limit your examples. I'm using him as representative of this tendency that I'm describing for Europe to want to pull away from the United States.
Let me read it, and then you can further explain it. This is September 13th, 2 days after September 11th. Nearly 2 days after the horrific suicide attacks on civilian workers in New York and Washington, it has become painfully clear that most Americans simply don't get it. Shock, rage, and grief there have been aplenty. But any glimmer of recognition of why people might have been driven to carry out such atrocities, sacrificing their own lives in the process, or why the United States is hated with such bitterness, not only in Arab and Muslim countries, but across the developing world, seems almost entirely absent.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's an extreme example of a writer who I think expects an awful lot out of a people who've just had, thousands of people slaughtered to come out and say, well, come to think of it, the bombers are right and we're wrong. I think that's expecting quite a lot. But September 11th, it has a great resonance throughout this book because there is September 11th is in its way an immigration story, and one of the things that has always sort of haunted me about it, and there are many things that haunt me about it, but one is that you had a mission that consisted of 20 people who were operating in Western countries, much of that time in Europe. And they were not just popping in and out. I mean, they were here for a couple of years planning this before the attack. But in all it would have taken for the attack to come apart would be for one of those guys to say, you know what, this is really a culture with a lot to say for itself. Or for one of those guys to have fallen in love, or for someone in one of the natives of those countries to which they had arrived to say, I don't like what that guy is doing. But that never happened. There was never, no one was changed by their, no one was changed by their 2-year sojourn in the West. And I find that quite haunting. No one, it means that to people just landing on the shores of the West, the appeal of the West it's certainly there, but it's not glaringly obvious, and it doesn't automatically transform people the way a lot of complacent Europeans assume.
What year did you start your research for this book?
It's tough to say. As I say, I started writing about Muslim immigration to Europe in the late 1990s. But the interest in this really picked up after September 11th. And there were certain episodes. In 2002, you had the called the Al-Aqsa Intifada in Jerusalem in the West Bank, where there was a lot going on, and there was a sudden radicalization of Muslim youth, particularly in France, especially. And there were a lot of attacks on Jews. There were, at one point, they were happening at the rate of about 5 or 6 a day. I mean, physical attacks. And that episode, in the spring of 2002, sort of convinced me that there might be something really gravely serious going on. And then after that, when that didn't really abate for quite a while, I started going over much more frequently, every month or two at one point. And then, as I say, it was pretty much a matter of course that I'd want to gather all this material together into a book.
Were there times when you went, it's a cliche, but the aha moments where you said, oh, now I'm beginning to really understand this?
I can't think of one. I wish I could. I wish I had one ready to hand, but I don't.
Did you change your mind in any way from the beginning of your research till the time you concluded the book?
I don't think I started off with a lot of preconceptions. I tend to be a person who's quite sympathetic to immigration. I mean, I certainly have been in the United States, and I know why immigrants come, and I know how difficult it is for immigration, for immigrants to be there. So I was not. I'm not predisposed to see a problem in all immigration, but that's not the book I really was to describe the travails of immigrants and their experiences and their motivations in coming is not the book that I set out to write. I set out to write a book about the transformation of European culture. One thing that surprised me is how deeply Europe's institutions and values were being changed. And I suppose a big surprise to me is that a large part of the price that Europeans pay for immigration is in the form of rights. That when you shift from being a culture that is sort of operating on old historical norms to being a culture that is dedicated to mediating between different cultures, you lose a lot. You, rather than just letting people go about their business, you have to set up ground rules for how people interact. Like, for instance, the French law against the veil. The French were very troubled by young schoolgirls wearing the veil in high school. But they felt that it would be unduly harsh to Muslims if they just said, well, Muslim girls can't wear the veil. So they went through this whole elaborate process where they impaneled a committee. They got some legislation set up which would ban the veil, it would ban the yarmulke, and it would ban what they call the large cross, okay? So that to address this very specific problem that France perceived, they had to take a little bit of rights away from everyone in society. And once they had the legislation ready, Nicolas Sarkozy, who is now the president of France, but was then the Minister of the Interior, traveled to Egypt on his vacation to meet with a sheikh to get the nihil obstat for this law. And that...
What's that mean?
I'm sorry. That's what you call it when the Vatican says there's nothing wrong with this going forward, you know. To get the okay from an influential sheikh at Al-Azhar, I believe, in Egypt. And that, I suppose, that might count as an eye-opening moment. That everyone knew it would take a lot of effort to integrate immigrants. Everyone knew it would take a lot of money. But the idea that it would involve certain sacrifices of rights, I think, is something that has become clear to me only over time.
Today, if you live in France and you're Muslim, can you wear the veil?
Well, you can wear it in public. This law affected only public building, only government buildings. And it goes back to what we were talking about, this French idea of citizenship, that everyone is supposed to be equal. The French state has always felt a great deal of liberty, has always taken a lot of liberty in saying, you all have to do this exactly the same way. So it is consistent with the French Republican tradition, even though it's a removal of liberties. But and the same thing came up in hospitals. You're not allowed in a French hospital, due to this same period of legislation, to say, I prefer a doctor of my own sex, or something, okay? But there's agitation now in France, much of it pushed forward by Nicolas Sarkozy, to get rid of the burqa, the total head covering. Now, as Steve Erlanger of the New York Times has pointed out, they're not really talking about the burqa, it's the niqab, it's the total cover that has just the slit for the eyes. But there is a movement afoot to make it illegal to wear that in public.
Now, in Europe, what's happened since the borders came down?
That is a big part of my story. And, I should make clear that this book it goes at this problem through every conceivable angle. One of the more important ones that a lot of people tend to ignore when they write about immigration in Europe is the European Union. The European Union, which was started as a group of 6 countries in the 1950s, has got bigger and bigger. There are now no longer any passport controls in Europe. So when you're in Europe, there are some to get into Britain and Ireland, but leave that aside. When you're in the European Union, you can go anywhere you want.
To the 25 countries?
Well, to 15. To the 15.
Yeah.
There's still some restrictions on the 10 new or 12 new Eastern European countries. But if you get into France, you can go to Italy, and if you get into Italy, you can go to Germany. So there's freedom of movement within the European Union, but due to popular outcry, all of the European countries have kept control over their own national immigration policies. So everyone guards his own door on the outer world, but once you get in that door, you can go anywhere you want. And it's obviously a really illogical situation. And so what has happened is that you've tended to get immigrants coming to whatever country happens to be laxest in terms not just of border controls, and in fact, border controls are not the most important thing. You fly in as a tourist or an asylum seeker usually, and you stay. It's a question partly of border controls, but more of which country has been the softer touch in terms of accepting stories for political asylum. And for a long time, those countries were the Northern European countries, Denmark, the Netherlands, and that's one reason why in both of those countries, where you had a very large asylum population, you've had a strong reaction against immigration in the last half decade. In more recent years, it's been Spain. Spain gave an amnesty to 800,000 undocumented immigrants about 5 years ago. And that was only the latest of many such things. And a lot of Spain's neighbors complained that what Zapatero was doing, the Spanish Prime Minister, Rodriguez Zapatero, was doing, was basically to, by giving these people European citizenship, he was basically inviting them to go to other European countries that had more generous welfare states than Spain did. Now, I should say that the European Union has decided there is going to be a common European immigration policy of some sort in another year, according to projections. But it's not in place yet.
You write this, immigration is Americanization. What does that mean?
Well, it's what I was talking about a little earlier. I started this book thinking that, describing America as a nation of immigrants is kind of a cliche. But now I realize it's a very profound thing. To be a nation of immigrants, to think of yourself as a nation of immigrants, is to surrender a certain amount of control over what your country is going to be like as time develops. you and I, living in this country, realize that our country is going to be largely shaped 100 years from now by people who are not here now, by the descendants of people who are going to arrive, may have different ideas. Our country, for all its greatness, has a greatness that drifts. Europeans think of their countries as permanent things. They think of their countries as things that don't drift, and they're going to have to get used to, if they want to persist with mass immigration, they're going to have to get used to surrendering a little bit of control over their future. And when I say immigration, is Americanization, I don't ever mean to say that immigration is the cause of all the changes that Europe is undergoing now. But it's the cause of many of them, and it's a symptom of the others. It tends to go with certain other phenomena, like deregulation of the economy, and women's rights, and the spread of human rights, all of which I think are part of an American-style Enlightenment.
After all the travel you've done in Europe, if you had to pick a country to go live in,
I have no desire to live in Europe. I'm very happy living in the United States.
But if what do you think the best environment for all the things you're
for the things
writing
I
about?
like?
Yeah.
The things I like? Well, look, to someone in Massachusetts, the Netherlands is a very pleasant country. It's very bourgeois. It's got a kind of a Calvinist heritage, which has become a kind of a, to the outsider, it may look like a kind of a left-wingery, and there's a tendency to sort of push every social experiment to its illogical conclusion. But there is a certain citizen involvement in politics, and a certain frankness about the Netherlands that I find really attractive.
You say in Europe racism is a terrible problem, but European problems is much more complicated than that, and you say their predicament is 1, population decline, 2, aging, 3, immigration, and 4, a steady implementation of foreign religion. Go back to the population decline. How significant is it going to be?
Oh, it's the European population decline is very significant. Europeans are very uncomfortable talking about demographics because talk of demographic decline was really rife in the 1930s, which was also a time when racism was rife and eugenics was rife. So Europeans are very uncomfortable approaching this topic, but it does provide it's an indispensable factual basis for understanding what's going on in Europe now. This gets discussed a lot. The average woman is going to have 2.1 children in the course of her lifetime to replace the population, to keep the population at the same size. If the average woman doesn't, the population shrinks. Now, I looked at the work of some demographers, including there's an excellent demographer at Oxford named David Coleman, who pointed out that, when you get down to like 1.8, the population is really shrinking. And it means that at the end of a century, you're going to have, only about a country about 2/3 the size. But when you get down to the level that Europeans are at, in some countries, like 1.3 children per woman, then the population really starts imploding. And if you want to keep, so you'll have like a quarter of the people, you'll fall down to like a quarter of your population in a century. And at that point, if you want to keep your institutions going, if you want to keep your buildings in repair, if you want to keep your parks open, if you want to keep cities from turning into a ghost from turning into ghost towns, if you want to keep the economy running, then you need immigration. My argument about this is a little bit nuanced. I would say that Europe did not have the need for this population replacement immigration when mass immigration began, but that now I would say it does face the choice between keeping its population the same and keeping its institution the same.
What's the birth rate among the white Europeans versus, say, the Muslim, African, Turks, and all that?
That is generally a difficult number to find. In general, immigrant birth rates are above those of natives, but it varies from country to country. And immigrant birth rates converge towards those of natives over time as they assimilate. But they have not yet converged absolutely, and there's still an awful long period of time when the immigrant population grows relatively faster than the native population. So, one needn't be unhappy about this, and one needn't read too much into it, and this need not be a calamity. But you're in a situation now where the percentage of the population that has its roots in immigration will grow in Europe, even if not another immigrant ever sets foot in Europe.
You also mentioned that Europeans are uninterested in paying for their defense. And
Yeah.
Americans are still all over the place. Or there's still 70,000 troops left in Germany,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
a lot of some military in Britain and other places.
That's not what, and I did not go into that too much in the book. The cost of keeping troops in Europe is not really what I'm talking about. It's more the American defense guarantee, I think, has freed up a lot of European energies and a lot of government resources for other things. And I think I wrote that in the context of this desire that I mentioned for a little bit more European independence from the United States. Before they can have that, they're going to have to be self-sufficient in terms of defense.
Jump 10 years or take 20 years ahead. What's Europe going to look like? What do you think our relationship will be? Will we still have American soldiers over there? Will immigration increase in Europe from where it is today?
Well, in general, I'm very reluctant to predict the future. This could go in. This is very dependent on policy and on mentalities. If you were predicting, what would be the nature of ethnic relations in the United States at the time in 1965. At the time of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, there were certain people who would have said they'd get worse, and certain people who had said they'd get better. I would say that maybe 10 years later, the people who said they'd get worse would have appeared to have been right, and 20 years later, the people who said they'd get better would have appeared to be right. So this is a complex process, but I think that one thing that seems clear is that Europe is heading in a more restrictive direction in terms of immigration policy. You mentioned it in the context of race. One of the big problems Europe has is that their immigration problem is their race problem. We have immigration on one hand, and we have race on the other. They're two mostly separate problems, and the result is that you can suggest changes in immigration policy without being accused of bigotry. The people who wanted change in European immigration policy were almost routinely accused of bigotry over the last 10 years. I think that is changing now. And I think that you see the growth of an attitude among mainstream politicians that Europe ought to be able to set whatever immigration policies it likes, as any sovereign state would.
What book is this for you in numbers?
This is numero uno.
Numero uno.
Yeah.
Now, you've written 20 years of your life here.
It's funny, isn't it?
How would you rate that experience compared to all the many articles you've written?
I really love the sort of the big process of synthesis involved in writing a book. I find it much harder than writing articles, because when I wrote my book, I did not want it to be just like a collection of articles masquerading as a book. I think that this book has a real arc to its argument, as an article would. But so to have each chapter arcing like an article, but the whole book arcing in its own way, I think is a real challenge. And I find that in writing a book, every single step takes twice as long as you think it's going to do. So, but I've really enjoyed the process of writing it.
Christopher Caldwell, author of Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, Immigration, Islam, and the West. We thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, bro.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.